Hello and welcome to Gaming Chat, the podcast where we invite members of the gaming community to join us to play their favourite multiplayer games whilst telling us about themselves and why they love these games so much, and members of the gaming industry to talk about their games they have worked on. I am your host, Mike, and I am joined by James Patton, and he is here to talk about his game, Duskpunk. So, James, please say hello.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Thank you for coming on. So let's talk. Let's start from the very, very beginning. If you can tell us a bit about yourself and your role with your company, Clockwork Bird.
Sure. So, yeah, I always wanted to make video games. Going way, way back.
Mhm.
I think the first one I made, I was like 10 years old.
Wow.
And eventually, it wasn't very good, but it was a finished game technically. And so I always knew that I wanted to kind of work in this industry. But I didn't have any qualifications that would kind of get me a foot in the door. So I just kind of taught myself how to code, and I taught myself how to use Unity and various kind of game dev tools. And I just started sort of learning enough to make my own games because I was always told like the the thing that is most impressive is not like having something on a piece of paper, but being able to say I shipped this game and I've finished this game, I pushed this one to completion. And so I sort of worked on games by myself for quite a few years, and most of them were quite broken and didn't really go anywhere. But I released a tiny game called Masks and Murder in 2015, which is where you
Okay.
you play a Renaissance noblewoman in Renaissance Italy, and you're being wooed by three horrible men who want to kill you and take your fortune. And so you need to lull them into a false sense of security and then murder them first. So it's a very
Interesting.
yeah. So, I it was a fun game because it was sort of I tell people the framing and their eyes would light up because they were like, "Oh, I get to murder horrible bigots from the 16th century or whatever." And
Yes.
the game itself was very simple. But after that, I was like, okay, I've technically shipped this thing. It's made me enough money to pay rent for a few years. Let's try and make the next one a bit bigger. And I worked on a management game for a year or so after that called Spinortality, because it's a cyberpunk management sim where you run a giant evil company, and you start by spinning these horrible, terrible products that are basically like the equivalent of social media or AI or TikTok or something, but on
Right.
steroids. So you start by spinning them so that people think they're irresistible, and you finish by using your technology and your power to become immortal. And that got to the point where it was kind of roughly I could sort of put together a rough demo, and I decided to run a Kickstarter for that because this was in the era where Kickstarter kind of worked if you had a rough demo of a game and it didn't need to be so polished. And that got me enough money to go full time. And then I worked on the game for another year or two and then released it. And then I partnered with a friend of mine, Danny Adams, who joined the company for a while. Because I thought that we could sort of make interesting narrative games together because his strength is in narrative. And so
Right.
then we worked on a game called Silicon Dreams, which is an interrogation sim where you interrogate robots to find out why they're broken. But they might just be broken because they're being disobedient, not because they're actually bad. And the question is like, are you willing um, to like doom one of these robots in order to further your own career? And lots of other sort of tense questions about like power and agency. And that didn't do as well as Spinaltality. And then there was this big kind of downturn in the games industry in 2023, where we were in the middle of working on a game that was a bit niche, but we didn't think that we'd be able to pitch it to publishers because the whole publishing industry was kind of falling apart, or at least in a very serious slump. And so in the end, Danny and I parted ways, and I went back to being a one man band. And I focused instead of that that the project that we were working on together after Silicon Dreams, I focused on Duskpunk, this new project, because that was more in the scope of what I could manage as like one person. Yeah, so basically, Clockwork Bird is me and a few freelancers who I pay to do art and audio and stuff. But I do the coding, the narrative design, the game design, the writing, and I sort of try to manage production as well. Though that's a bit of a like a game of Jenga almost, because it's always a bit chaotic.
I bet, I bet. So I suppose, I mean, it's covered a little bit about this next question. So like, in what capacity are you involved with Dustpunk? So I'm guessing like production, coding, that kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah. So I do the production of like what is everyone doing and what do we need next? What's the timeline? Design and narrative design, which are not quite the same thing. Narrative design is like, where are these story threads going and how are they affected by player agency? And the game design itself is like the moment to moment experience of like what mechanics do we have, what resources do I give the player, how do I kind of get the emotions out of them that I want to get with the tools that I have. And writing as well. There's quite a lot of writing in this game because it has a lot of text in the cutscene sections. And then I have freelancers for PR because I'm not great at PR and social media. For audio and music, and for art, and that includes like background art, character art, and UI art. So there's a lot of people that kind of try and pull together. But I think all my freelancers have been fantastic, and they all kind of get the vision of the game, which means that it's actually quite easy to kind of pull them all together into one cohesive like result.
So when did the development first begin for Dustpunk then? What really inspired its creation?
So it was. I'm going to be very honest. This was
Honest
August.
is good.
Yeah, this is the benefit of being a solo dev. I can be as honest as I want, and nobody can stop me. So it was August last year, and I we were just coming off kind of a larger contract, which is we've been contracted to write a tabletop game. It's called The Hidden Isle, and it uses tarot cards instead of dice, and I'm actually quite proud of it. But another company paid us, Danny and me, to do it, and I was looking at the contract like finishing up because the game was done, and I was like, okay, if we keep doing this larger scoped game that we were working on before after Silicon Dreams, if we keep doing that, we've got about 3 months of runway, and then the money just runs out. And I was hearing on social media, in the gaming press, people were saying things like, "This is the worst year in like since the video game crash in the '80s for the games industry," and all of the investment is running out. All of the publishers are kind of fleeing because they overinvested a few years ago, and now they kind of overextended themselves. And I kind of looked at the situation, and I was like, well, this is not good because I don't think this is going to work. I just don't think that we have the industry is in a place where it can fund this game, because this game is kind of weird and it needs another year of development. And I don't really know. I can't imagine anyone actually backing it given the headlines I'm seeing. So I talked to Danny about it, and I said, "Look, at the end of the day, I don't want to go ahead with this project, and I don't think that I can keep like employing you because there's just not enough money." And I sort of had to take a really serious look at like, if I had to make a game super quickly, and if it were a bit rough, but if the goal of the game was largely just to kind of scavenge together enough capital to kind of get me back on my feet again, what could I do in a kind of in an emergency situation? And I just played this fantastic game called Citizen Sleeper by
Right.
Gareth Damian Martin, and I think that game really it takes the mechanics of a number of other games, and there's kind of the basic kind of setup of a number of other games, which is you're a nobody, you're stuck in big, complicated sort of city or station or whatever, and you have to like explore and survive. And that's quite similar to like a number of games that I had played. Most notably like Fallen London, which kind of does that in a sort of Gothic Victorian sort of setting. And I
Okay.
thought, that Citizen Sleeper really kind of extended that premise, and it told that story in a really cool, interesting way, and it had some really interesting mechanics that made it even like more compelling than it had been than these stories have been told before. And I was like, okay, well, Citizen Sleeper, if I think about it, is a few character portraits. It's actually like 20 character portraits, but I was like, I don't need all of them. It's fine. Citizen Sleeper is some character portraits and a map and a ton of writing. That sounds like something that I can do. And if it has to be small and scrappy, and there's only 8 characters, and the map is just me reusing public domain assets like that, maybe that will be enough. Maybe it's fine. But that sounds like a game that I could make that could make me some money. And I thought, okay, if I'm gonna make a Citizen Sleeper like, because it felt to me like this was a new genre that happened to only have one game in the genre, but it felt like a new genre because it was so interesting and so different. What kind of world would I set it in? And I'd always liked the world of Dishonored, this kind of steampunk, diesel punk world inspired by Victorian London.
Yeah.
But the one thing I didn't like about Dishonored is it is at the end of the day like a kind of stealth action game, and I always wondered like what lies beyond those missions where you have to strangle people and stab people and shoot people in order to progress, right? I always wondered what would it be like just to walk around the world of Dishonored and never have to stab anybody, or maybe stab the occasional person because it's a video game. But to
Balls.
be like, yeah, like if they really annoy you, maybe. But like what if you were just some guy and you weren't this kind of superhero character? What would that be like? So I thought, okay, I'm going to make a game like Citizen Sleeper, and it's going to be set in my version of a kind of steampunk, diesel punk Victorian city. And I thought, well, if I absolutely have to, then I can have it done in 6 months. And then thankfully, I got some funding from other sources, which allowed me to extend the game and use more artists and better artists than I thought I would be able to. So now, like what started as like a desperate attempt to try and remain solvent and keep my apartment basically has turned into basically like a long drawn out labor of love where I think that the world that I'm seeing now in these images that I'm getting from artists and in from these like background images, these portraits and stuff, where it really does feel like the like weird, vibrant, disturbing, inspiring city that I dreamed up like more than a year ago now.
I mean, 2023 was a very, very difficult year when it comes to like the video game companies and publishers, and we're not going to name names. They know who they are.
Yeah.
Where they went around basically what a lot of us, common folk look at and think is just a massive spending spree, and just went around buying up studios to, help
Mhm.
fill out their portfolio. And then it came to the point where it just imploded on itself. It's like, okay, so we've got
Yeah.
all these development studios, but they're not creating any games because they won't let them create any games. And it's like, well, now they're not generating any money. So then they just start selling them off. But unfortunately, because they've done that, they've, you know, laid off like basically all the staff that made those companies, those studios, and then they've had to like go off and try and find their way out into the world, or start up their own studios again. And then basically they lost the IP that made them, so to speak. And then they've got to start off again with a new IP or a new like studio name. And it's like, well, who are you guys? Well, we were the guys that worked on this game. And it's like, ah, right. And then people have got to take a chance on them again. And technically, that's not fair because they've already, proven themselves as, game developers. And it's because of these unfortunate circumstances with the big publishers coming along and buying them up,
No,
and then just
exactly.
like
And
selling them off. So, yeah.
yeah. And I think there's the companies that were doing the buying, they either thought that more people would continue to play games at the same rate they did during the pandemic. And I
Yes.
could have told you that that was nonsense because, you let people go outside and it turns out the outside world is quite nice. I love video games,
Yeah.
but, you had to touch grass, as it were, now and again. And so some of these people just, were they thought the line would keep going up, and it didn't, which is ridiculous. I also heard a rumor, and it is a rumor. I don't have any like sources or evidence to back it up, so take it with a grain of salt. But that one of these companies was interested in kind of building up its portfolio in order to appear more kind of to make itself more appealing to outside investment from like very
Oh,
large investors. And so they kind of
gotcha.
deliberately overspent on the understanding that they would gain, billions in investment, and then the investment never came because the investors changed their mind. And at that point, they were like, "Well, we've effectively bought 100 white elephants. We have to make cuts now." Which is ridiculous. And it's just an example of capitalism getting out of hand and crushing the little people in its wheels, really. So it's very unfortunate.
It's very unfortunate, and like you said, I mean, all these big companies, but it doesn't stop like the board of directors and the president of these companies getting huge sums of money and
Oh yeah,
bonuses, and then the people
yeah,
that were actually making the games for these companies are now at home, and they're lucky if they're getting welfare. They're lucky if they're getting dole money. It's
exactly.
it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not right, is it? It's not right.
No, not at all, not at all. I can talk about that a bit later when I talk about my inspirations for the game, if you want.
Yes, yes, we will do. So, can you give us I mean, you've already touched a little bit on it, but if you can give us a bit more of an overview of Duskpunk, what kind of game it is, and what is about?
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of like its genre, it's half a resource management game because you need to survive in the city. So you need to manage your health, your stress, your hunger, your time, that kind of thing. And the other half is it's like a narrative RPG, which means you have skills. You can raise skills with XP, and they make certain things easier. You can make meaningful narrative choices, and you can meet characters, and the choices that you make result in like different outcomes and different quest lines. Um, so basically, it's like it's not as detailed as an RPG like Disco Elysium, for example, where you
Yeah.
actually like see your character running around, but you do kind of choose where to go from this large map, and then once you're at a location, you choose what actions to do, and the actions might cost a resource like time or money or something. And then for most actions, there's a die roll which will test a skill. And so that's kind of that moment of making that dice roll is kind of the main sort of mechanic, and it's very inspired by tabletop games because I wanted to. I was more interested in giving people like a broad series of choices. Like you can make money by picking pockets, or by conning, or persuading people, or by working in a factory, or by this or that. Because I like tabletop games where you can where they're very open, where there are multiple
Right.
routes to the same solution. And I've always thought that that's something that like digital adaptations of tabletop games have struggled with a bit. Um, I think that they're getting better at it now with games like Baldur's Gate 3, for example, and Disco Elysium, which are very flexible and very open. But for me, I was like, I want to make a game where yeah, you can start the game as a soldier who's good at fighting people, or you can start the game as a writer who's just good at talking, and both paths are going to be like valid and totally doable. Because I've played a number of RPGs from like the 90s and 2000s where like you can't get through on like a charisma based character, and you need some kind of like combat build, and I just don't find that so interesting because I think life's about more than just fighting people at the end of the day.
Uh, and especially, it gives a lot more importance to charisma, because charisma
Mm.
is what sways people more than anything.
Yep.
It's not so much about how well you fight, but it's how well you talk and how your opinions align with the opinions of other people. And you think, hey, actually, he's making a lot of sense because that's what I think. So charisma does have a lot to do with these sort of things, and especially like in games. I mean, I know it's more common in like RPGs and that where you have like your stats that you have to build up, and obviously charisma is one of them. And yeah, no, there is a lot more importance that should go into charisma than there are in a lot of games. I mean, a lot of games, you can kind of get through without having any charisma, but then at the same time, there may be like certain sub quests and things where unless you've got a decent level, you're not going to get anywhere.
No, exactly. And I'm of the opinion that like I wanted to make a game that was kind of fantastical because it's set in this weird city, but was also quite
Yeah.
sort of relatable and familiar to players. And I think that in real life, in modern society, having a high a high sway stat, as it were, is much more useful than having a high skirmish stat. So yeah.
Now you have a 2025 release date or 2025 release window in mind for
Mhm.
Steam. Are there any plans for a Duskpunk demo before the full version becomes available?
So I think that the plan is that we're going to aim to release in the middle of the year somewhere, and we're going to release the demo. Like when you have a narrative game, it seems like people tend to get quite attached to the game when you first announce it because they're like, "Oh, that looks really cool. The world is cool. The characters look fun." But then they quickly lose interest if they can't play it like quite soon. My understanding of the sort of PR strategy is that we announce the game and then like mere weeks after that release a demo, and then mere weeks after that release the full game. So I'm pretty sure that there will be a demo available because I think demos. I think for narrative games, it makes sense to give out a demo because it kind of lets people like feel out the world, which
Mhm.
is not necessarily true for like an action game because some people play the demo and then they've sort of had their fill. But if you get really attached to the world in a narrative game, then a demo totally makes sense. So yes, I don't know precisely the timeline, but I'm pretty sure that a demo will be released beforehand, and certainly I'm 90% certain that I'd also release a demo alongside the full game as well, so people can try it out.
That does make a lot of sense, to be fair, because like you're saying, like with the demo now, there are a couple of things that you can do with demo. So there's like cross progression. So like if you play the
Hmm.
demo up to a certain point, and then obviously it's the certain point in the game, and then when you get the full game, you'll be able to carry your progress over into the full game.
Yep.
Releasing it a couple of weeks beforehand is also a good ploy because, like you said, you just touched upon, if you release a demo like months before, then people will play it, they'll get interested. Then, like a couple of months later, they've forgotten all about it. And then the
Yeah.
game comes out, and it's like when you start playing the game, then it's like, oh, okay, maybe it's not quite how I remember it. I don't know. I don't know. So, no,
Yeah.
releasing it a couple of weeks before helps, keeps people engaged, keeps people involved, and it's definitely going to be helpful, and especially even if it's not like a couple of weeks before, but at the launch of the game as well, so people can actually try it and then think, actually, no, we are interested. I want to download this game immediately. Have you a favorite historical quote that appears in Dustpunk?
So yeah, I try not to like get high on my own supply, as it were, too much. It's very easy when you're world building to kind of to spin out all of these characters and all of this history or whatever.
Mm,
But I did want to start the game with like a quote from one of the characters in the game, because there's this revolutionary who's written a book about like the state and how to revolt against it, and what the state even is under like in this city under this sort of industrial capitalistic system. So I wrote a short quote to begin the game with to kind of get people in the right headspace for like what to expect in the game and to help them understand where the people of the city kind of understand the situation to be. So the quote is, "Tyrants appear all-powerful. This illusion is broken only at the moment of their downfall. I cannot know when dusk will set on this rotten empire. I only know that no matter how long the day, dusk will always come." Because I think it's quite easy for the player to be focused on just surviving at first, and I want
Yeah.
to clue them in on the idea that, like, the surviving is paramount, it's very important, but this is about more than just one person surviving. This is about a city kind of awakening to revolution.
I must admit that's quite a powerful quote.
Thank you.
That would
So
make
I
Shakespeare jealous, I think.
well, that's high praise. That's high praise. I tell you why it's powerful. It's because this is where I might lose half of your audience. I apologize in advance. I the inspiration for the game was partly these historical examples of revolutions, but it's also the fact that I have a really serious problem with capitalism in our present day,
Yeah.
and I believe that it cannot. I don't fault anyone for having faith in the system and hoping that it will turn around, because that's only natural. But I think that it has contradictions in it that ultimately it cannot solve by itself. Like, we fix one problem and then two problems crop up, and you're seeing that in, like, ever since, like, 2020, we've had crisis after crisis. We've had a crisis a year, give or take, and before 2020 we had, like, one every decade, and before that we had a much stabler kind of period of sort of capital boom. So I literally joined the Revolutionary Communist Party in my city, which is an international organization that is dedicated to, like, educating people about what communism is, about the fact that it's like an overthrow of the capitalist class by a much more democratic political system, that would then run like a nationalized planned economy, which has numerous benefits. Um, but where I got this quote from is I went to a one of our events, and we were watching a film called October, which is a film from the early 1920s about the Russian Revolution, by, like, a Russian revolutionary film director. And I had to research the film a bit, and pointed out that, like, it's worth bearing in mind the fact that tyrants do appear all powerful until the moment that they topple, because the Russian Tsar seemed all powerful until he was toppled in 1917. The German Kaiser seemed all powerful until he was toppled in 1918. And it's not until, like, the moment where everyday people see just what kind of power they have when they get out onto the streets, and they realize that they don't have to put up with this nonsense anymore. It's not until that precise moment that a way forward seems really possible. Um, which is ultimately why I joined the organization, because it's important for me to learn this stuff so that I'm ready to help people when they are surprised by that eventuality. Because if we know that it's coming, then we can kind of train for it and study history and study theory so that we're ready to just sort of give people another option when it does happen. So
Wow, it's getting very political here. I mean,
yes.
to help try and bring back the
Hmm.
anybody who just lost. I mean, hopefully not. I mean, to be fair, I mean, we are all entitled to our opinions, and let's be honest, you can't be too far one way or too far the other, especially when it comes to capitalism or communism. Now, for example, I live in Spain. Now, although it's not, as you would say, communist per se, but like the current political party originally was made from the communist movement back in like the 1920s, around that time. So basically, it's like the workers' reunion, something like that, workers' union. And now, obviously, the problem is that now, because capitalism's good and communism's bad, which is what we've always been force fed from like superpowers and stuff like that, who've had such great economies over the years. Not so much recent years, though, mind you. But like you said, it has gone the other way, where things are far too expensive, and where before you could probably do a couple of weeks shopping on about £100. Now you're lucky if that's a couple of days. So, with the cost of living constantly going up, prices constantly going up, we do need some kind of regulation on that because, like, for example, rental. Anybody who has to, live or wants to become independent, young people particularly, it people are getting older and older before they even leave home. I mean, like our dads and our mums, and they were leaving home at the age of like 20. They're buying their first house and da da da. Now we're still like in our 30s, mid 30s, late 30s, living at home with our parents
Yeah,
because
exactly.
it's just too expensive to rent anywhere. And why? Because there's no rent control. Why is there no rent control? Because people are free to put up with whatever prices they feel like, because tourism helps increase rents in
Hmm.
certain touristy areas, and because of that, nobody can afford anywhere. So it does become difficult. So you can't be too far
Yeah.
left, you can't be too far right. You have to read between the lines, and everybody has to think, "Do you know what? This benefits me in this way, but this also I can also benefit from the other side as well." But it's finding a medium between the two and not feel too indoctrinated to go one way or the other. Both have their positives and both have their negatives as well. So let's make this light again. Let's move past politics. Even though let's face it, a lot of like games all have some kind of politics involved, especially
Hmm.
when it comes to like fantasy games and tyrants and despots and you know toppling the monarchy and stuff like that. And also like the games like Civilization and Age of Empires, and that is all also very very political as well. So to say that, oh no, video games aren't political, they very well can be.
Absolutely.
And
I think every game is political in a sense because every game says something about the world it's set in and might allow you to intervene in that world and its power structures. It's just whether or not it's sort of obvious about
whether it's very, very subtle or very, very in
it.
your face. So, can you tell us more about Duskpunk and sorry, so I've got one question here that I'm just trying to think of how to best to word it. It says, can you tell us more stress in Duskpunks and explain the dangerous
Ah,
consequences to too much stress in Duskpunk? So I'm guessing there's
yeah.
like one stat which is about stress.
Exactly, yeah. So the main stats that you have are you need to manage your time and your money and your health and your hunger. So you need to, like buy food and use your time wisely. But there is this extra stat called stress, which is kind of inspired by tabletop games, because there's a number of really good tabletop games that use stress, and I was sort of inspired by them. So what happened? The way that stress works is that every time you sleep, there's a pretty good chance that stress will go up because you are a soldier who has escaped from this universe's version of World War I, and so you have like night terrors, you have PTSD. So
Right.
stress tends to rise over time, and eventually you need to take care of it, which you do by they don't have like therapists or affordable healthcare. So most of the time in the early and mid game, especially, you deal with stress by like using illegal drugs, which are kind of like opium, which in fairness was how people dealt with stress in the 19th century. So
That is true.
um, yeah, there's some history for you there. So you need to like find a source of drugs so that you can take care of your stress, so that you don't kind of burn out. The negative consequence of gaining stress is if you gain if you pass certain thresholds, like if you hit 50% stress and then like 75 and then like 90 or whatever, then every time you roll a die, if you're over the first threshold, then any one you roll counts as a zero, and then
Right.
any two you roll counts as a zero, and then any three. So that sort of means that you'll be fine if you roll high, but it kind of erodes your ability to roll adequately. It's like at first it's like, oh, I'm only a bit stressed, it's fine, I can work around it, and then it becomes like, oh no, I really am quite stressed, and this is becoming a real hindrance because I want to create this feeling in the player that like it's like they've broken their ankle, and the solution
Right.
is, well, you could get it fixed, or if you can't afford it, if you don't have the resources, you could just avoid walking on that leg. I
Yeah.
want to create that feeling of like of precarity, of not being of kind of having to make do under difficult circumstances. And then if your stress goes all the way to the top, then it resets, but you take a like a scar or a wound, which is you get like a negative modifier to one of your skills, and the skill
Okay.
cannot be raised with XP until you heal the skill, and you do that by resting, but it's kind of a lengthy process, and it's best to avoid it. So that's sort of where I realized that the game was kind of a burnout simulator a little bit. It's like if you push yourself too hard, yeah, you can totally you can totally push yourself too hard, but your body will kind of demand a cost. It incurs a debt. But stress is also in a way kind of a good thing because like it's always bad to have high stress, but there is this extra mechanic, which is that if you make a like a skill check, if you make a roll and you don't
Yeah.
like the result of the roll, then you can just re-roll it, and all it costs is one stress, right? So if
Right.
you use that sparingly, then that means that you can use stress to your advantage because then you're stressing yourself out when it matters. But
Yeah.
it's so tempting to push that re-roll button if you're just frustrated. So I'm almost trying to trick the player into like making.
Like life in general, to be fair. So,
Yeah.
like, when we're talking about dice, are we talking about the six-sided dice or a D20 here?
These are all six-sided dice because
Right.
and every skill check is you just roll two six-sided dice, and you need to be above a certain threshold.
Right.
There is a slight adjustment, which is that if you hit like the target number, then you succeed and everything's fine. If you roll one or two below the target number, then you get like a partial success. So it's not great, but it's fine. It could be worse. It's this middle ground where you usually like you either partially achieve what you wanted or you totally achieve what you wanted, but there's some kind of a cost, like a negative consequence. And then if you roll below two below the target number, then that's just a total failure. Um, and for some actions, like failure or a partial success is like you just don't do the thing you wanted to do, or you do it much less effectively. And for some actions, like risky actions, you actually like you lose some resource, or you take some kind of a negative consequence, like losing hunger or health. If you energy or health, I should say, if you don't make it. So there's a whole kind of spectrum of the different sort of potential outcomes. And the reason I picked 2d6 as a like two six-sided dice as my kind of skill check system is that I quite like the way that system it has a tendency to bunch in the middle because you're more likely to roll a seven than any other number. It creates like a bell curve. And so I
Yes.
quite like the way that by just raising your stats by 1 or 2 points, you can move from one side of the bell curve peak to the other. And what was like a 37-40% chance becomes like a 60-65% chance of success. And I think that's a fun way of seeing, oh, I only put a few points in this stat, but it had a really serious impact on my ability to pass these checks, which I found quite satisfying when I was experimenting with it.
So, given how much importance choice is in the game, what have been some of your favourite choices to make in Duskpunk, and what have been the most riskiest choices?
So I like these choices you make when you're talking to characters and you have to make a call, which is like, do I trust this person? Am I going to work with them? Am I going to hold something back? So I think that like those narrative choices, especially when you're dealing with like revolutionaries or criminals or like gangsters, that they're a lot of fun because with some characters, it's very easy breezy. It's like, hello, I'm this person. I just want to work hard and earn money for my three kids or whatever. And those characters are very fun and nice. But when you're like face to face with a gang leader and they say, uh, I think that you're a mover and shaker in the city, so I want you to accept this pouch of coins. And you're like, what's the catch? And they say, there's no catch. Just accept the pouch of coins. I'm a gang leader. I run a mafia. There's no catch at all. There's no strings. You're like, okay, so there are strings, and they're not telling me what the hell do I do now. So that I'd say that's one of the funnest choices and also one of the riskiest because you really need the money. Because you need money to survive in this game, but you have no idea what the cost is going to be down the line, or other choices like, am I going to join this sort of criminal enterprise where their main income is like beating people up and mugging them? But like maybe they can protect me, and maybe it will be good to have an in with them because it's better to have them as allies rather than enemies. But maybe getting in cahoots with them is going to have a negative effect if they do something that I have a real problem with ethically, right? So
Yeah.
those are the questions that I think are most interesting. In terms of like just more straightforward actions that are sort of more repeatable, that are still risky. There are some fun actions in just sort of the early game where you like, for example, there's low risk actions where you just make money by begging or by conning people or by picking pockets, and like those are fairly low risk, but they're fairly low reward. And then the two high risk, high reward actions are one of them is like doing bare knuckle fist fights, where you can make a lot of money if you win a fist fight, but it will cost a lot of health if you lose. And so that's
Yeah.
quite risky. And then the other one is just working in a factory because factory regulation is absolutely terrible. Very much inspired by English industrial history. You
The Industrial
the
Revolution.
Exactly. So these jobs in the game and historically are better paid than the alternative, but there is a risk that you might lose a bit of your hand or something if something goes wrong. So it's one of the most efficient early game routes to money, but you have to manage it carefully because if you don't have the right skills, then it might be more harm than good. So those are my sort of go-to examples of like risky actions in the early game.
And on the subject of skills,
Mhm.
for anybody who is going to be playing Duskpunk, what skills would you say players should focus on developing the most? Should they wish to, obviously survive the vast
Mhm.
dangers of Dredgepool in Duskpunk?
I would say like part of the philosophy of the game is that all you can make any skill work. So if you wanna pick sway, if you wanna be a writer and a speech maker, that will totally work. It just might be a bit tricky in the early game. I'd say that if you just want like a slightly less bumpy early game, I'd say you should probably pick endure because that's the skill that will allow you to work at the factory at lower risk, um, and it also has other benefits. And you could also pick um, sneak because sneak is like the stealthy pickpocketing skill, and pickpocketing is a
Yeah.
very profitable way of making money in the early game, and it's relatively low risk as well. And one of the kind of bonus abilities that's sort of powered by the sneak skill is every time that I think it's called I forget what it's called, but it's this bonus where every time you use the sneak skill, there's a chance that you might just earn some extra money just by sort of sneaking some loose change wherever you might be using the skill. And so that's kind of a nice way to just to make a little bit of extra sort of change on the side. You could also do worse than focusing on skirmish as well, because towards the end of the game, skirmish is important because of the revolution and having to like fight in the streets and stuff. You're not forced to, but skirmish sort of really comes into its own then. And you can also make good money skirmishing in fist fights, and you can reduce that risk by by focusing on the skirmish skill. And there's another ability I think where if you focus on skirmish or endure, then you can raise your maximum health points, and so that also helps to
Okay.
mitigate risk because you have a bit more of a margin there. So there's many different options, but if any of those appeal, then people can focus on those ones, I'd say.
Now, on the topic, you touched upon Citizen Sleeper earlier, and how part of it, helped to inspire Duskpunk. What have been some of your personal favourite tabletop RPGs to play?
That's a really good question. So the game that this game is most inspired by is a game called Blades in the Dark, which was a really groundbreaking kind of a. It's like a game that focuses more on narrative, like collaborative storytelling, as it were, rather than just sort of number crunching. Because like I love D&D, but it can be a bit difficult remembering all of the stats and all of the abilities and all of the things you can do with a bonus action and all like it just D&D is a bit more complicated than I'd like it to be. And it's more combat focused than I'd like it to be. Whereas in Blaze in the Dark, um, every skill check is handled the same as every other skill check, so that there's no kind of priority given to combat. And like I think there's 3 different skills that are all just ways of making somebody do what you tell them when you talk to them. So rather than just having like one charisma stat, there's command, sway, and mingle, which are like 3 different attitudes towards what it even means to talk to somebody, which I think is really cool.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think Blades is great because it's really slick. It has this really good kind of long term engine in terms of like if you just keep playing Blades session after session, then a narrative will come out of it because there will be other games that incur your territory. There will be long term goals that you want to have, and it's a really fun kind of dark steampunk city as well. So yeah, I love Blades, and there's this other game that I've got into recently called Mothership, which is a sort of sci-fi horror game inspired by movies like Alien, which
Right.
is it really does a great job of making you feel like you're stuck on a ship or a space station and everything's fine, and then suddenly everything is not fine and people start losing their minds because a major mechanic of that game is gaining stress every time. Any time you fail any roll, you gain stress, and the higher your stress, the more likely you are to panic. And if you panic, then really bad things can happen. So it's a
Game over,
fantastic.
man. It's game over.
Exactly. So yeah, it's such a good. What I like about Blades and Mothership is they're both like as stripped down as they could be. They have they don't have too many skills. Blades has 12 skills, but they're very easy to use. It has a really slick inventory system. Mothership only has 4 skills and 3 stats, which are like active and passive skills, basically.
Right.
And the way that you check, and in both games, the way that you make a roll is super simple. You don't need to do all of this, adding 1d4 to this thing and then remembering to add another 2 because of this modifier or whatever. It's they're much they're really slick. And I should also mention again the role playing game that I made, the Hidden Isle, which is very inspired by Blades, but uses tarot cards instead of dice. It's set in an alternate history, kind of 16th century setting, like a sort of Renaissance setting, but one where all the magic that people thought was real, all the magic that the alchemists and the magicians believed in, actually does work. And it has like it sometimes the cards are just used for regular skill checks, but sometimes the cards are used to generate characters or scenarios because tarot cards have a lot more meaning than just the numbers.
Yes, it also depends on, well, also depends on, how you actually use the cards, because obviously there's
Mm,
sometimes, like, if the card is upside down, it also has a different meaning. Also there's, I'm trying to think what the name is. There's like, now obviously, like with typical like playing cards, you have suits, don't you? But they don't have
yeah,
suits in tarot, but it's something similar. And
they
I'm
they
blanking on
do
the name.
have they do have they have suits, but they're in the you might be thinking of minor arcana because basically
That's
you
the
have.
one.
So in tarot, you have the minor arcana, which are split into four suits, but they're swords, wands, cups, and pentacles instead of the more
Yes.
familiar suits. And they have a few more face cards as well. And then the major arcana are they were originally just like a trump suit, so like a special suit that always won against non-trump cards. But they were much more kind of lavishly illustrated, and they're the ones with fun names like the Tower or the Chariot or Death.
Yes.
And so,
You never
and
want to
so
get
that
that card.
no, well, death. I mean, death is not too bad. Death means like a serious change, and change is not necessarily bad. It can be death,
Yeah,
but it can
at
be
the
like
end of
just
something, but not necessarily your life.
yeah.
It could be a
Well,
life.
one hopes. One hopes.
Yeah.
The tower is much worse because the tower is like about like large scale systemic collapse. It's like a catastrophe.
Oh dear.
Even that one
Yes.
has like like a wink of hope in it because
Mm.
something always comes out of the ruins. But yeah, the tower is a much more serious like collapse. That's definitely the worst one to draw. Yeah, so we use the major arcana in particular for those fun moments where you're like, okay, let's draw six cards and make a whole adventure out of that on the fly, or let's draw a card to determine what kind of character you're meeting on the other side of this door or whatever. So it's much more. It feels more like a collaborative storytelling game than most tabletop games do because it's more about kind of almost divining the story together as a group. But it does still have like skill checks and abilities and stuff. So you are still playing a character. It's just that as a player, I think you have more control over where the whole story goes because there is this element of like divination in the storytelling itself, which I think is quite fun. So
Well, going back to Duskpunk, the whole reason
mhm.
why we're here. I mean, it's great talking about
Yes.
other games as well, but obviously we're here to promote your game too. So,
Yes,
like
and
with
thank you for
Duskpunk,
that very much.
now that all of the mature content is depicted solely in text rather than
Mhm.
visually via images, what led you to this decision?
So there's two reasons basically. The first is that I would much rather have a game that hits hard, but is not like gratuitous. Where yes, there is violence and death and drug use and all of the horrors of Victorian England or whatever, but it's there because it needs to be there because the story needs it, not just for a shock factor. So for me, like if it's in the story, it has to be in the text because this game tells a lot of the story through text. But I didn't feel the need to illustrate a lot of these like gratuitous moments because I didn't want them to be gratuitous. I wanted them to be just part of the story. But the other reason is that like I have these images. There aren't that many visual assets in the game because I want to try and make every asset go as far as it can in terms of bringing you into the world and making you feel the atmosphere. And
Right.
so, like if I have a character portrait, if I have a background image for a location, if I have a map asset, there's like most of the time those locations and those characters are not going to be doing something tremendously violent. They are just going to be doing their thing. They're going to be living in their world as the story dictates, which means that it would be kind of silly to have like one illustration of a particularly violent moment because that would be kind of a waste of resources. Like I could spend that artist money on like another like location image or another character portrait rather than this one moment that's over very quickly. So it made much more sense to me to use like audio cues and like an image like just like a red flash that appears on the screen that kind of prompting when you take health damage is much more effective, I think, in communicating like that something bad just happened, rather than having like a bespoke like custom image for that one particular moment.
Right. Now, talking about one of the main characters, now you said one is a writer, another is an ex-soldier. So
Mhm.
let's talk a bit about the ex-soldier, who basically he's hopped out of the frying pan and has landed straight into the fire. Can you tell us a bit more about our unsung hero?
Yeah, sure. So all of these characters are technically ex-soldiers. The what you're choosing when you start the game is who were you before you got conscripted into the army? Were you a writer, or an engineer, or a thief, or were you a career soldier already? And so those four characters kind of define your starting stats. If I have time, I'd also like to give them like bespoke actions and even maybe bespoke quest lines, but I don't know if I'm going to have time for that. But what's true for all four of these people is they've all been thrown into this horrible war, this great war, and this is also a war where in this fictional setting, the scientists have discovered a way to turn corpses into like a potent fuel source. So that they're able to turn the bodies of the dead, whether they've been dug up from cemeteries or just killed in the war, into like an oil that can fuel the war even more so, and that is kind of powering parts of the city and is very profitable. Because I wanted a metaphor about like how different people are exploited. The aristocrats get to keep their dead in their crypts, but the poor people have to say goodbye to their loved ones and their bodies, and those corpses are then turned into this fuel source. So where you wake up at the start of the game is you've been taken for dead. The war office thought you were dead because you were badly injured, and like chucked you on a barge full of corpses, which is being sent to Dredgeport, to the capital, to be rendered into oil. And so you kind of wake up in this nightmare horror scenario, and you kind of you're able to like escape the ship, and make it to the city and try to start a new life. So what's true across all of these characters, no matter what your origin is, none of them want to go back to the war. Even the ex-soldier, like the career soldier, is like, no, this is a death sentence. I thought war was maybe a good idea, but no, it's this has become a horror show. And so all of them are um, very eager to avoid being sent back, and that is like your main kind of driving focus for the first like third of the game is how do I survive and how do I avoid being sent back to the front, because that would be a death sentence.
Now, what would you say is Duskpunk's hardest learning curve in terms of like developing the game and then playing it?
So you mean like what did I have trouble learning, and also what will the player have trouble learning?
Yes.
I think for me it was probably production, because I've got like 5 or 6 different artists. I have 2 different sound people. It's a lot juggling all these people, and it was a
Mhm.
real learning curve for me figuring out how do I keep them all on the same page, and how do I budget enough time where I can just tell them what I want, where I can get an image that's in my head into their head so they can draw it for me. So that was probably the hardest thing for me. If I were a player, I think probably the hardest thing would be like finding those like figuring out those early sources of like where can I find food, where can I find drugs to reduce stress, how do I heal, that kind of thing, because those early sources of resources are a bit tricky to find. And
Right.
that's, I think, where most playtesters have been a bit hung up. I think I've fixed it enough now, but that was definitely a solid problem in earlier versions of the game. Yeah.
And how long would you say a full playthrough of Duskpunk would take on average?
I'm aiming for like 10 hours minimum. I'd like it to be around 12 or 13 if you look at all the content. So because I want it to be kind of as long as a novel. I want it to be like a world that you can properly sink your teeth into, but that doesn't outstay its welcome.
Now, your game was recently playable at MCM Comic Con London XEGX. How was the fan feedback like?
I mean, I wasn't able to be there in person, so I can't speak to the people who were there physically, but I got a lot more wish lists just through Steam, um, just immediately after the con. So I think that that shows a real interest in the game. And I got a few emails of people saying, "I saw this; it looks interesting. And I'd love to sort of to test it or whatever." The feedback from people at other cons I have been at, I was at a con called Game City in Vienna recently, because
Right.
that's where I live. And that has been, I think, quite positive. Like everyone has said that the game looks great, which is good because I worked very hard polishing it with my artists, and I'm glad that that came through. But a lot of people like there are some players play it a bit and they say, okay, it's fine, it's not for me, but good luck. And then some players played it to the point where they played it for over an hour and they played so long that they discovered a game-breaking bug because I didn't think anyone would play that long at the convention. So some people have literally played it to breaking point, and I think
Oh,
that's a
wow.
really good sign. Yeah.
Well, it is because I mean, a lot of the times, I mean, when you are testing a game yourself, or like when developers are testing a game for themselves, they know generally how they want the game to work. So they're going to play the game how they would
Yeah.
expect it to be played. But then when you put it in the hands of somebody who's completely outside of the development team, or just a gamer, they're going to try completely different things. They're going to try these exploits to see if they can beat the level any quicker, or if they jump on this point, is it going to take them to some kind of secret? And then therefore they start finding these things in the game that you don't even know even existed in the
Hmm.
game. So it is helpful in that sense because if they find a bug that you were never aware of, because I mean you can test and you can test and you can test absolutely rigorously, and
Yeah.
then it's like this has never happened to me in 100 times that I've tried it. You've come along once and you find it within 5 minutes. It's Murphy's law, but it's good because then that way I mean it does say that having an extra pair of eyes helps, and it does, especially when it comes to like finding bugs and things, because then at least you'll be able to find out what they are, and if you can replicate it, well then you'll know how to fix it, hopefully.
No, exactly. Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself.
So if you had to compare Duskpunk to any other game in terms of like gameplay, overall theme, or story, what would you say is its closest match?
Again, I would say Citizen Sleeper because that's a game where, again, you have a blank slate protagonist. You get you have to kind of survive with no support at first in this big kind of city. In Citizen Sleeper, it's a space station, but it's basically a city in space. And it's about figuring out how to survive while you're exploring more of this space, exploring more opportunities, while like getting access to resources that you need to make it. I think both games have a real interest in like trying to kind of scavenge a life together from the bits and pieces of like a city that people think is kind of broken. I often say that like Dustpunk is a game about like surviving and scavenging in a city where there is enough stuff, like the world has given you all you need to survive, but the city itself is run by people who would prefer that you die. And it's about that kind of tension. And it's also like it's a bit similar also to the life and suffering of Sobrante, which was another
Right.
very excellent narrative game that came out a few years ago. That's a game that's set in a game that's more kind of 18th century French Revolution rather than 19th century industry. But it's also very interested in like societal shifts and revolution and how like societies develop over time and become and people can become radicalized. And yeah, and it's about those sorts of questions, and it ends in a revolution, so that sort of seems apt. I think those are probably the closest match. Yeah.
Most important question now, probably the most
Yes.
important question of all of them. Could you list the platforms in which you hope to release Duskpunk on?
So it's definitely going to be on PC. I hope to release on Mac and Linux as well. Um, I would love to release it on more platforms, but as like a one-man show, I don't really have the expertise to do that. I think it would do quite well on Switch. I think it would be a really natural fit, and I'd love to release it on other consoles. But I haven't done that before. I don't really know how, and I don't think that I would have the time or the space to do that. So if anyone would like to help me with that, then just get in touch. But for now, I think that's something that might happen post-release, but only if the game is wildly successful.
I mean, we wish you all the best with the launch of the game, obviously next year. And if it can come to Switch, it would be a great fit because, especially with like the portability, or even on the Steam Deck as well, because of that
Yeah,
portability, you'd be able to bring, Dustpunk along with you on your journeys, and you can, play the game as you're on the train or whatnot if you're
yeah,
traveling in handheld mode. So
yeah.
yeah, fingers crossed for that
I
as well. And if
I am
the
pretty.
likes, yeah, go on. Sorry.
I will just say I am pretty sure that it will work okay on Steam Deck. I'll need to get access to one to test it, but it's not that demanding, and there are settings that you can use to turn off but like particularly demanding visual effects on the map, for example. So I'm pretty sure that even if it doesn't have like an official sanctioned Steam Deck release, it will still work okay on it. I just need to add like controller support, which is a pain, but it shouldn't be too hard. So Steam Deck maybe, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, like with all good things that must come to an end, so must this podcast. So thank you, James, for joining us today. And thank you as well to all our fantastic viewers and listeners at home for taking the time to tune into our podcast. I am going to pass it over to you, James, so that you can plug your stuff. Where can people find you? Where can people find out more about Dustpunk? The floor is yours.
If you want to learn more about me and the other games I've made, then my studio is called Clockwork Bird. And so you can go to clockworkbird.net to find out more about me and those games. If you want to learn more about Dustpunk, then the best place is probably on Steam. It does have a Steam page, and you can wishlist it there, which would be fantastic. The game is spelled Duskpunk with no space. And I'm on Blue Sky and Twitter and Threads as either Clockwork Bird Games or as James Patton. If you search, then you'll probably find it pretty easily. And I have all those links on my homepage, clockworkbird.net anyway. So that's probably the easiest way to get there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that again, James. And until next time, everyone, keep on gaming.